Right, my clock says 6:01. So I think we'll kick off because we're going to try and keep this to exactly an hour. We always like World Jewish Relief to be strict on timekeeping, and so everybody can get back get into their kitchens for supper or dinner or whatever you're eating tonight. So a very warm welcome to many of World Jewish Relief's supporters, friends and colleagues. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're going to be hearing this evening from my outstanding colleague, Beth Stauffer, World Jewish Relief's Head of Older Persons Programs, been with us for an amazing 10 years, and then to Professor Gill Livingston from UCL, a leading global authority on dementia prevention. And we're absolutely thrilled to have Professor Livingston with us here this evening. I mean, I don't need to tell everybody here, dementia touches us all. And I'm sure many of you, have had friends or family impacted by it. It's important that we speak about it, understand it better, so we know how to minimize the risk and also to support those that are living with it or helping those that are living with it. And this evening's webinar is therefore particularly relevant. We're also going to hear a little bit about our work in Ukraine in addressing the needs of an older, predominantly Jewish client base there. World Jewish Relief, I'm sure many of you know, have been working in Ukraine for almost 30 years, and a central focus of our work there has been the provision of life-saving and life-changing assistance to an older, predominantly Jewish client base. And that includes dementia assistance, even in the midst of the horror of conflict that's going on. Ukraine currently dominates World Jewish Relief's operational theatre amongst many difficult contexts that we're working in. And again, as we know in the news, is being absolutely pummeled by Russian forces. Only last Friday night, Ukraine received, I think it was 540 drones and 40 ballistic missiles in one evening alone. Also, interestingly, Ukraine has the single largest number of older people affected by conflict worldwide. I read that 1/4 of Ukraine's population is over the age of 60, and 1 in 3 individuals in eastern Ukraine requiring assistance is also over the age of 60. So a really important context to learn more about this evening. Just a reminder, I'm going to ask Beth to speak for about 10 minutes and then Gill to speak for about 20-25. And we will have time at the end for questions. And if you want to pose questions to us, there's a little button, a little symbol at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please, as your questions come to your mind, type your question in there, and myself and my colleagues in the office here will help process those questions, and hopefully we'll get through as many as we can in posing them to Gill and Beth. So without further ado, let me hand over to my expert Russian-speaking older person specialist, Beth Stauffer, currently in Manchester. Beth, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just share my screen. Everyone see that? Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure to be at World Jewish Relief for over 10 years now. And actually reflecting on it, almost all of those 10 years, I've been involved with dementia since we started the dementia program just after I joined the organisation. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about the work that World Jewish Relief has been doing in Ukraine, particularly on dementia, and just to put it into a bit of context. So it's always interesting, I think, to start with a few stats on the Jewish community in Ukraine. And it is hard to estimate the size of the Jewish community at the moment due to factors which you'll understand. The full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation has reduced the size of the Jewish community and the general population. So we know that before the war, there were between 45,000 and 140,000 Jews in Ukraine, depending on how they self-identified. Since the war began, over 17,000 have made Aliyah. They've moved to Israel, and many others. I mean, we don't have an exact number, will have joined their fellow refugees leaving to Europe, or have become internally displaced in Ukraine. And so those left, as Paul has rightly highlighted, it is very much an older person crisis in Ukraine, with a high proportion of older people left behind, and the Jewish community is no exception to that. So as Paul's mentioned, we've been working in Ukraine for a long time. This year we plan to work with around 6,000 older, vulnerable, mainly Jewish people, and we support essential home care services, active aging activities, which involve exercise and healthy living, and regular social activities, both in person and online. And we also provide home repairs for people, which is even more relevant these days, given the level of attack that Ukraine is under. So thanks to this support, ironically, thanks to this support, the Jewish population, the Jewish community members are living longer, which of course, as we know, due to dementia, which increases with age, means that they are more likely to develop dementia. So in 2015, when I joined the charity, we started a partnership. We started looking at, together with Jewish Care initially, at trying to understand how the older people in Ukraine and the surrounding region were coping with dementia, because we very rarely heard it mentioned. I just also wanted to put dementia slightly into the context of the history of Ukraine as a post-Soviet country, which is that, historically speaking, people with disabilities, including dementia, were very much stigmatized, kept out of public view. And many of you may remember this famous statement from a Soviet official at the 1980 Moscow Olympics, saying there are no invalids, which is the term for disabled people, in the USSR. So they were hidden from view, and particularly when that's combined with an ageism approach, this was very detrimental to older people with dementia. So there was a system of institutionalization which continues today in many post-Soviet contexts. In around 1979, there were 1,500 institutions for older and disabled people across the territory of the former Soviet Union. And these were typically, especially the institutions for elderly people, would have had extremely poor quality care. People were often left there with no justification. There was very little medical support. They were hidden from view. They were specifically located outside of public view. And actually, this photo is one that I took during a visit to an institution about 15 years ago in Belarus. This was a lady with very advanced dementia. And this was possibly one of my first experiences of dementia in this context. So in 2015, when we started working with Jewish Care, we did some scoping visits to Ukraine and surrounding regions, speaking to lots of different people in the community and outside the communities. And we found there was a prevailing Soviet attitudes to dementia, and people generally misunderstood dementia. They thought it was a normal part of aging or a psychiatric disorder. Very, very low levels of official diagnosis, very late in the day. Usually if somebody needed to go into an institution, they would receive an official diagnosis, typically of Alzheimer's. We saw a lot of caregiver burnout among professional and family carers, and that there was insufficient activities for people with dementia and support services for their carers. And we also came across quite a lot of stigmatization, including derogatory language. So things like, senile, somebody's gone doolally, or they've lost their mind. And so following this, we designed a program with Jewish Care to address some of these issues and enhance the knowledge of dementia within the Jewish communities, but also trying to reach beyond the Jewish communities, since our Jewish members don't live in a vacuum. So we conducted 8 training programs and many more shorter training programs for our partners in Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and Georgia. Jewish Care very much leading on the content design of this. So we looked at the very basics: what causes dementia, what is dementia, what are the different types of dementia, how might they manifest. And then Jewish Care introduced the person-centered care approach, which is trying to understand the person's background in order to provide a better quality of care for them and engage them in more meaningful activities. And we tried to use we used a train the trainer approach to try and pass on the knowledge, which has worked in that our local partner staff now are able to deliver trainings on their own to their peers. And as I mentioned before, we tried to involve local institutions, medical and social, anybody who wanted to come along to the programme within the Jewish community. We welcomed them, and we really tried to share that knowledge far and wide. As part of the visits that we did, we visited clients, Jewish community members in their homes, and this particular story is something that I remember extremely well. The lady on the right, this was in Minsk in Belarus, and I visited with Gill from Jewish Care, who some of you may know and remember. And the idea was really to see how people were coping at home and give some advice and reassurance to carers as to the approaches they were using. And this lady was non-verbal. She had quite advanced, possibly Alzheimer's disease, and she had nothing to do all day. And we could see that they had taped up the cupboards and the wardrobes so that she couldn't harm herself and she couldn't pull everything out of the cupboards, because that's all she wanted to do. So Gill started to ask the family and the carers around us, what did she do when she was younger? What was her occupation? They said she was a sports masseur. She did massage for sports people in the Soviet times. So Gill encouraged this lady to then start giving her a massage. And Gill always says it was the best massage of her life. She remembers it because this lady had still maintained her skills and she enjoyed doing it so much. You can see the enjoyment on her face. And then there was some dancing and some other interactions, despite the fact that they didn't speak a common language. And in fact, this lady didn't have any language at all. So it's just an example to bring to life some of that exchange of experience and technique. We also brought our partners to the UK to visit Jewish Care and other care provider services. This particular photo from Southend, to day centres, lunch clubs, just for our partners to observe and participate in activities and then take those ideas and concepts back to their local communities. And so this worked in the case of a couple of our partner organisations, then started a Dementia Friends movement within their country to try and inform more people about dementia. And then following this, we were able, within our programmes and in our context, we were able to introduce dementia services and adapt existing services to make them more suitable for people with dementia. In 2023, we hired an Israeli social impact consultancy firm to look at the impact, since we've been working on this topic for a number of years. And they conducted interviews and questionnaires and desk research together with us very closely. And amazing stat that we got from that was that 86% of family carers and professional carers who had participated in the programme felt their knowledge of dementia had increased. And you can see a couple of the quotes here on the screen around, it had a transformative change, the new approaches and the knowledge that they gained. And they completely changed their approach and their way of talking to people and trying to maintain that sense of calm and quiet and not arguing, not getting agitated if people were asking repetitive questions, etc. Of course, as Paul mentioned today, the ongoing war in Ukraine is having a huge impact on our Jewish clients, and the whole population is impacted, of course. But for people living with dementia, there's a heightened stress of noises, relocation of family members, losing family members, confusion if they've been forcibly or if they've chosen to evacuate, although many haven't. And the question of where would they relocate to? So people are so attached to their homes, and if you have dementia, it's even more distressing. The thought of having to leave your home and go into a new environment is extremely distressing. Another challenge that we have seen is that mainly the staff who participate in our training programs have left the country or left the region where they were working, which means that we don't have the same level of qualified staff as we previously did, and recruiting new people is also extremely tricky. Diagnosis rates are still low. It's around 6% of cases of dementia are diagnosed officially in Ukraine today. And there's a lack of treatment options that you might see in other countries, although I know they're quite limited. They can be quite limited, but in Ukraine, they would be even more limited. And Ukraine is very much under pressure to deinstitutionalize, to shut the institutions and introduce new models of care. But the funding and the political will and the capacity of the Ukrainian government to do that is just not there. And there's still widespread stigma and misunderstanding around dementia. You can see that 28% of people in a recent survey said they would hide their diagnosis, and only 37% could actually define what dementia is. So to finish, what is World Jewish Relief doing? How are we continuing to support this area of work? A couple of years ago, we started to partner with the Ukrainian national dementia charity, Nizabutny, which means unforgettable. And they work on a strategic national level to try and introduce legislative changes to this particular area, working with social and medical healthcare ministries. And they are advocating for the Ukrainian government to adopt the first national dementia plan, which would put into place a series of requirements for the Ukrainian government to improve diagnosis rates, treatment options, social care options, etc. But it's a very long process, and you can understand there are different priorities. We remain committed to supporting our Jewish partners. We now fund dementia activities in 14 locations in Ukraine alone, and we continue to promote person-centered approaches and to bring our partners and share knowledge and recent evidence. And so I'm so delighted to have Gill here today, because we talk a lot about dementia risk reduction, as does Nizabutny, and sharing such recent and such up-to-date knowledge with them on the modifiable risk factors for dementia is really important. So really pleased that I will be able to share all the knowledge that we will get from Gill's presentation with our partners. And just to say thank you very much for your support, and we'll be happy to take any questions following Gill's presentation. And now I will hand over to Gill, and we also have some slides from Gill.
Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm really delighted to be here. World Jewish Relief is a wonderful organisation, and I've just learned quite a lot more about how wonderful it is from hearing Beth. We had a go at sharing my screen before, and it was really quite unpredictable. So Paul's going to help me, we'll just go through it. So I'm going to talk about, can we prevent dementia? And if you go on to the next slide, thanks. I just wanted to say that the work that we have done is, I've been leading it, but it's by no means by myself. There's a huge number of people who are working with me to do this, and it's an international work and done by experts in a really large variety of subjects, and in particular, some people have who've done a lot of this sort of number crunching and work. I just want to mention Andrew Summerlad, Jonathan Huntley, and Nahid McAdam, and we've been supported by the UK Research Institute and the Dementia Charities. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about why we would consider dementia as preventable, a bit about a life course model and dementia risks, what it means, and the cost and benefit, and what we should do. And I'm going to skate over the surface because it's a lot to talk about and we haven't got very much time. But I can answer many more questions and can and do talk about it for hours, but we're going to do it within the limited time. So if you move on to the next slide. I want to say a bit of what Beth has been saying, and Paul, that why should you care? Well, dementia is the greatest global challenge for health and social care in the 21st century. If you ask people aged 50 and over about what illness they fear most, the answer is, the majority answer is dementia. And that's because people lose not just their independence, and it's something that leads to an earlier death, but they also lose their past and their ability to make decisions for themselves, and therefore people fear greatly that they might develop it. More than 55 million people have got it currently worldwide, and that's predicted to triple by 2050. And that increase is driven worldwide by the welcome reduction in people dying young. So in some ways, it's a great success, but as Beth said, it's very linked with age. And it occurs mainly in people older than 65, and the prevalence and number per thousand doubles every 5-year increase in age. Dementia affects the individual with the condition, so they lose their independence, their knowledge of themselves, their knowledge of their family and what they've done. It affects their families who have to look after them, and it's very difficult to look after people with dementia, watching them deteriorate and often not understand that they've a problem and resist getting help. And it's a huge number of dementia carers develop depression or anxiety, and that often leads to breakdown of care, and it affects wider society. So currently it's thought to cost 42 billion in the United Kingdom, nearly as much as the rest of the health service, and it's 1.3 trillion worldwide in 2019. Despite that, dementia is not inevitable, not even in your 90s, and certainly not by retirement age. And what it is, just to say, as Beth said, lots of people didn't, it's decline from previously attained cognitive levels. So that decline is personal. It depends how high up you were to start off with. And that decline is accompanied by an impairment in activities of daily living function or social functions. So it's not just that people don't remember, it's that they can't do and relate in the same way. Can I have the next slide, please? So why am I going to talk about prevention? In case anyone has any doubts, prevention is better than cure. And here are 3 examples of illnesses which have been prevented. So I wanted to talk about John Snow and the Broad Street pump. So what happened in the last outbreak in cholera in England, John Snow decided to put dots on the map and find out where the cholera was. And everyone, he found that all of them except for one family were sited round this Broad Street pump. And he went to see this other family who told him they used to live in Broad Street and they liked the taste of the water so much that they went back and got their water from Broad Street. So he realized that it was from the pump. And at that point, nobody knew about bacteria. And when he said it came from the water, people just thought he was completely crazy. So he took a very active public health role, and he broke the handle off the pump so that nobody could get water from it. And since then, we've never had any more cholera in England. So that was an incredibly useful preventative measure. So no one thinks that, don't use condoms to prevent AIDS because we've got HIV, drugs. So whatever drugs we have, it won't take away from the fact that it's extremely useful to prevent illness rather than to cure it. But unfortunately, we don't have any drugs which might cure it. Can I have the next slide, please? Nonetheless, what's happening now is in high-income countries like Europe and the United States, we've got reduction in the age-specific dementia rates. So if we're thinking about the number per 100,000, then in Europe and in the US, there's been a 25% reduction in 20 years in the number per 100,000. So there's a lot more people with dementia because there's a lot more older people, but there's many fewer per 100,000. And that decline is only really in those people with more education or wealth. So that's, and in men more than women. So dementia is potentially partially preventable, but there's a lot more that can be done. There's huge potential to do more for everywhere, like even in Britain, not to mention in places like Ukraine, where there's much more potential throughout the earth. And the mechanisms of prevention are thought to be 2 things. they're thought to be increasing cognitive reserve, and I'm going to explain that in a minute, and a reduction in damage. Kind of the next slide, please. Okay, so what this slide shows is post-mortem results from people who may or may not have had dementia. And if you look at the bottom left-hand slide, it shows the amount of neuropathology, that is damage in your brain, things like plaques, tangles, Lewy body, mini strokes in your brain. And if you look at it, as you would expect, on average, the more damage you have, the more impairment you have in cognition, the more likely you are to have dementia. But if you look at the other slides, the other graphs, if you look at the top left and the bottom right-hand graph, you can see a huge overlap in the amount of, so some people with high cognitive performance by the time they die have as much pathology, as much damage as some people with late dementia. So having this neuropathology, having the markers of Alzheimer's, doesn't inevitably mean you're going to have dementia. And this is what we call cognitive reserve. It's the ability to sustain damage without developing dementia. And one of the things that helps with that is education. But I'm going to talk a lot more about the other things that help. Can I have the next slide, please? And here we look at some obvious reasons why in high income countries, it might be that fewer people are developing dementia. There's a massive reduction in smoking, and that is continuing. People in general have more education. So when I was born, you only had to go to school till you were age 15, then they had 16, now it's 18. I think when I went to university, it was about 4 or 5%. Now it's nearly 50%. And there's reduced cardiovascular risk factors and mortality as we have statins and lower blood pressure and lower smoking. So there's been massive change in both what might cause more cognitive reserve and things that might cause damage. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what we did in this Lancet Commission on Dementia was we looked at the evidence and came out with 14 important risk factors for dementia, of which we think the evidence is really quite clear that these are things which make more people more likely to develop dementia. And I'm not going to go through all of them in just reading them out, but I'm going to talk about quite a lot of them in the next minutes, or 10, 15 minutes. And I don't think people are generally surprised that education could be protective. And I don't think people are surprised that things that might damage your heart, might damage your brain. But I think the sorts of things that people are very surprised about is that hearing loss can make a difference, that depression can make a difference, and that air pollution and social isolation and vision loss can make a difference. So there are some things that might seem natural and some things that are less so. When we first started doing this, so we've had 3 commissions now, but when we first did this, a lot of people thought really we were just making it up, but that's changed. The world has changed. And people now understand that this really makes a difference. And can I have the next slide, please? And what we have done is we have drawn an infographic to look at all of these risk factors together. And we've done some quite complex maths to come to these conclusions and considered that people are not like laboratory rats, that they often have more than one risk factor and that these tend to cluster. But the answer, if you look at these 14 risk factors, is slightly over 45% of dementias are caused by these potentially modifiable risk factors. And in theory, if these were changed worldwide, then the dementia rates would almost halve. Can I move on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about some of them. So education, educational attainment and cognitive activity. The Jewish community has always been quite big on education, and that's probably excellent for a great many reasons, but including reducing the risk of dementia. Now we know that not only dementia not only schooling makes a difference, which makes a massive difference, but cognitively stimulating occupations make a difference. So if you look at this graph at the bottom, I'm going to explain it to you. If we regard people who have neither cognitively stimulating occupations, and if we think about them and they've had no and they don't have education, then people who work in cognitively stimulating occupations but didn't have much education, and surprisingly there's quite a lot of them, they have about 80% of the risks of that risk. And then if we consider people who have education but don't have cognitively stimulating occupation, they have about 70%. And then if you think of people who have both, then they have about 60% of the risk. So education reduces the risk of dementia, and midlife cognitive stimulation at work reduces the risk of dementia. So it's really never too late to continue having midlife or late life cognitive stimulation. And there is evidence that early retirement increases the risk of dementia. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm moving on to hearing loss, because hearing loss has the biggest hazard for dementia if you look at the whole population. And most studies on the risk of dementia for people with hearing loss at baseline find that there's a huge increase in the risk, and that's what this graph shows. If you start to wear a hearing aid, then you lose that risk. And wearing a hearing aid is quite hard and requires perseverance and ability to change the batteries or to charge it. But nonetheless, it really seems to make a huge difference. And more studies keep coming out showing that it makes a difference. If people even have developed mild cognitive impairment, which is an at-risk dementia state, people wearing hearing aids, it doubles the time for them getting dementia. And I think this is something that is getting out there a bit, because I went to a wedding last week and 2 people told me that they're wearing hearing aids because of my research. And one of them told me that if he developed dementia, he and his family would blame me. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Other modifiable risks, high blood pressure. Treating high blood pressure reduces the risk of dementia, and that's particularly in midlife. Traumatic brain injury. When I went to medical school, which was quite a long time ago, we knew that people who had a head injury might never recover. But what we didn't understand, and we do now understand, is that traumatic brain injury, which is mainly avoidable, can lead to the chances of dementia for over the next decades. And now I feel I can barely look at the news without seeing about sports-related head injury and people developing dementia. And I'm working with the World Rugby Federation to see what we can do to prevent it. And that's really, really quite remarkable for somebody who knows absolutely nothing about rugby. But most of it is preventable. In low-income countries, it's mostly from road traffic accidents, and in high-income countries from falls or violence. In America, there's quite a lot of dementia and people who have been in the armed forces as they had head injuries within it, and that tends to be in people's 40s and 50s. Moving on to physical inactivity. Physical inactivity is a big risk for dementia, but the good news is reduction in risk is greatest when you move from being extremely sedentary to some physical activity. So I'm not suggesting you need to run ultra marathons, but it's really important to start moving, and it makes a big difference. And exercise at any age seems to be helpful for cognition. Then moving on to diabetes. Midlife diabetes is really quite a big risk factor for dementia. People don't want to have it, but have diabetes. But the good news is that there is now indication that the new drug treatments for diabetes also make you half as likely to develop dementia. Cholesterol, it's common to have high cholesterol, and in midlife it's a risk for dementia, but statin use in midlife again decreases the risk of both dementia and specifically of Alzheimer's disease, which is a type of dementia. There's a clear opportunity. For air pollution, I'm glad to live in London because clean air makes a big difference in areas that have changed the amount of air pollution. Then we find an increase in the amount of memory of the people in the local population and a decrease in dementia. So I'm in the clean air zone is a fantastic thing. And I hope that it spreads throughout Britain. Visual loss is another one, and similarly probably to hearing loss. People who have vision or hearing loss find it much more difficult to be part of activities and much more difficult to enjoy life and see other people and do things. I think we all understand that people don't necessarily notice when they can't hear, but people often don't notice when they can't see as well. You don't know how everybody else is seeing, nor can you yourself. I was recently in Israel and was a bit stunned when I went to see a play and they had subtitles. I couldn't read any of it. I didn't know there was a problem with my vision. I came back and went to the optician. So get your vision checked. Can I have the next one, please? So obesity in midlife, intentional weight loss is associated with cognitive improvement. And by intentional, I mean that people who lose weight and it just comes off, maybe they're probably ill, but people who try and lose weight, their memory and thinking improves. Less frequent social contact is associated with dementia. We think now that increasing social contact improves memory and thinking in different parts of the brain from intellectual stimulation, which is, I think, interesting and useful to think of. You won't be surprised that drinking huge amount is bad for your drinking huge amounts of alcohol is bad for your brain, but it's quite easy to drink 21 or more units a week by having a large glass of wine every night, which a very large glass, but people often do, which is like 4 or 5 units without ever being drunk or thinking you're abusing alcohol. So it's relatively simple to do something about it by decreasing, having days that you don't drink or decreasing the size of glasses. And still, I'm not suggesting you stop drinking altogether. And I'd like to say for various members of my family that Shabbat drinking still counts. Depression in midlife is related to dementia. And the good news is that treatment helps both psychotherapy and drugs and that lift the depression, again, reduces the risk. And smoking, all doctors tell you not to smoke. I'm telling you that smoking is bad for you like every other doctor. But the good news is that even stopping for 2 years takes away your excess risk. So again, it's never too late. Can I have the next one, please? Can I skip that one? And then skip that one. So my message is there are risk factors which increase your risk, but changing the risk factors changes the outcome. Use of hearing aid decreases risk of dementia. When air pollution reduces, cognition gets better. When high blood pressure is treated, that gets better. People without much education are relatively protected by jobs with high cognitive demands. Stopping smoking reduces risk, reducing alcohol reduces risk, treating vision impairment reduces risk, treating high cholesterol reduces the risk, treating depression. It's important to think about these changes with people at risk. I think when we're thinking about Ukraine, as well as all of us individually, people tend to be more at risk who have relatively less good economic and social circumstances, and we need to try and target those at risk. Can I go on to the next slide? One of the things that people tend to say is it's all very well, but how can we afford it? Well, I think there's several reasons we can afford it. Governments are about reducing things that matter, about changing the things that matter most to people, and dementia matters most to people. But the other reason that we could change it is that we have that if you model the cost savings in England, you have to do cost savings in a particular country. If we change the formulation of food to decrease salt, which we know decreases people's blood pressure, we would expect there to be a 2.4 billion savings. And if we changed the formulation of food with sugar so that people became less obese, we'd expect to have a billion savings. Equally, other sorts of savings are not quite as spectacular, but we've calculated, and changing other things as part of public policy should save rather than cost money. We've also calculated an individual policy, and providing hearing aids and treating high blood pressure should also save money for dementia. So can we go on to the next slide? So we've begun to change policy. A recent Lancet commission, this is what Public Health England said, shown that some modifiable risk factors for dementia are including smoking, weight, physical activity and blood pressure make a difference. And they're supposed to communicate this to all individuals having a midlife NHS check, and it be part of the programme. And the next slide, please. Equally, in the United States, they have goals to reduce the burden of risk factors. They say they're going to aggressively address, not just address, 10 potential risk factors. And they want to decrease dementia by 15% per decade, decreasing the number of people with Alzheimer's disease by 1.2 million in 2050. Let me go on to the next slide. So what am I going to say to you? I'm going to say that overall, we've got new hopeful evidence about dementia prevention. When I went to medical school, we felt that dementia just came in a random way and there was nothing you could do about it. Well, now we know that almost half of worldwide dementias are potentially preventable from tackling 14 risk factors. And we know that there will be more, but the evidence is not yet clear. There's much more evidence that interventions make a difference, both for individuals and in terms of policy, and that the changes are often cost savings. And the other thing that we know is that people not only avoid dementia, they don't just get it later, but they have more illness-free years and fewer years of ill health who are to have development. And that's what people want. They want a healthy life, and they want a compaction of morbidity, we call it. They want fewer years at the end when they're unhealthy. So I'm asking you to be ambitious about prevention, to take part in this, and you individually to keep working. Can I have the next slide, please? And that's it. That's what I was hoping it was. And to keep being able to, you can do a huge amount to decrease your chance of developing dementia. Some people will still develop dementia, but they will have less years with it. And other people will never develop dementia and will not know whether their actions have led to it. Thanks for your attention. Very happy to answer any questions.
Gill, that's fantastic. Gill and Beth, that's fantastic. Very practical, very serious, a bit frightening. very humorous. We like the show about drinking, and has already triggered quite a few questions from the floor. So Jill, I'm going to fire at you a couple of questions, and I've got a couple for Beth as well. Jill, you talked about cognitive stimulation being important. Could you give some practical examples of what do you mean by that?
Yeah, or practical examples of what I don't mean. I don't mean doing Sudoku. It's part of a package of things. It's having new experiences, doing new things, doing different things, doing things that make you think. So we're all together. I hope people are thinking with me tonight and answering questions, talking to people because you don't know what they're going to say, seeing new things, taking up activities, cooking new recipes, reading more, seeing new entertainment, whatever you enjoy doing, because otherwise you won't continue to do it, but have a variety of things which stimulate different parts of your brain.
Thank you. Jill, another one. Is there any evidence to suggest that it's genetic or hereditary?
Dementia,
Yes.
yeah. There is a few people, about 1 to 2% of people who develop dementia have, it's probably not as much as that, probably about 1% have a dominant gene. That means 50% of the next generation will get it, and they tend to develop it very young. So that's a minority. For other people, there are genes that make you more likely to develop it. And that's a particular gene which is important. It's called ApoE4, apolipoprotein E4. The good news is that people who have a genetic propensity, if they take these lifestyle changes, if they see their GP, keep themselves active, don't smoke, don't drink, then socialize, then they are still, that helps them as well, and they're much more likely to have many more disease-free years.
Thank you. Jill, I've got loads of questions here. So bear with me. I mean, quite a number here about once somebody has been diagnosed, is it possible to slow down deterioration? Are there treatments that slow down progression and may even reverse it? So quite a lot about once diagnosis has happened, how to minimize it deteriorating further.
Yeah, it's quite complicated because there are different sorts of dementia. There's a therapy called cognitive stimulation therapy, which is a little helpful and helps a little. If you keep physically healthy, then that slows down deterioration. So it's very important to help people with dementia take their medication, keep their blood pressure under control, eat well, because they often forget, and drink well so they don't get infections. And that makes a vast difference in how quickly you deteriorate. There is medication which helps a bit, but again, not dramatically. Nothing gets people back to normal apart from very uncommon types of dementia. So medication helps a little bit. And then there's a new medication which is not available on the NHS, but which has been approved, which are for amyloid. It's quite burdensome. It needs currently infusions once a month. It's very expensive and it only helps a little, but it again helps a little.
Jill, you are absolutely amazing. That's why you're a professor. Fantastic. So a couple more here. Again, two related questions. Is there a correlation between neurodiverse conditions and dementia? And is there a connection between Parkinson's and dementia?
I'm not sure about new and diverse conditions. I'm not sure what it means, but let me talk about Parkinson's. Yes, there's a Parkinson's disease dementia, which often happens to people late in Parkinson's disease, when they can begin to develop dementia, and it has a particular, so people often have Parkinson's disease for a decade without having any change in their thinking or in dementia, but after that, many people in 12 or 15 years might develop a dementia. There's also a relatively rare condition called Lewy body dementia, where people have movement problems preceded by the dementia. But there's a similarity. It's just the pathology is in a different part of your brain. So yes, they are related to dementia, and can happen within it. And again, it's a different sort of dementia.
So the reference to neurodiversity.
Oh, neurodiverse. I thought you said new and diverse. Right. We don't really know about neurodiverse syndromes. I mean, neurodiversity means different things to different people. So if you include dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, as attention deficit disorder, then more than half the population is neurodiverse. But in general, if you have less cognitive reserve to start off with, so some people with autism have a normal or superior intellect, but some people have a low intellect. If you have a learning disability, then you're more likely to develop dementia, and you're more likely to develop it younger.
And I've got a couple of questions, then I've got a couple for Beth. I mean, a question here on the gender differences that you highlighted is between men and women. Is that particularly linked to life expectancy between men and women, or is it about other levels of cognitive stimulation or employment levels?
I mean, it's taking into account life expectancy. So women live longer, but taking into account that there are more of them, that it is more common in women. In countries where women are highly educated, there is really very little difference. So it's probably a lot related to that.
Right, thank you, Gill. A couple for you, Beth, here. I mean, a number of people have commented on the recognition of the horror of what older people are facing in Ukraine, and a question about how do you, Beth, make choices about what you support, given that everybody needs assistance, and where does dementia fit into the priorities amongst other needs of older clients in Ukraine?
That's quite a difficult question. Yeah, there are a multitude of needs for older people. Even before the war started, older people were economically disadvantaged, typically quite socially isolated, and the quality of housing is also really poor. High-rise, poorly built flats, inaccessible for people with mobility impairments, sight problems, etc. I mean, we work with a number of trusted local organisations who we've worked with for a long time, and we trust them to really consider what the greatest needs are. And that does change. So we saw, where we previously had invested a lot in, we're starting to invest a lot in dementia and, more social activities, active aging, etc. Once the full-scale invasion started, we did have to divert funds, and we were lucky to raise additional funds to meet real humanitarian crisis needs, food, hygiene items, and particularly during the strikes on the energy infrastructure, we provided winter support, thermoses, torches, generators, even, for our partner organisations. So we try and be flexible within the funding that we have, and we have a very individual approach as well. We know our partners very well; they know the clients very well, and so they are the ones who will let us know where the greatest needs are. But we do have a certain distinct range of programs that we support, like dementia, like home care assistance, home repairs, we're one of the very few agencies funding home repairs in Ukraine. And if you think about prioritization of needs, if somebody doesn't have any windows because their building has been hit by a missile or a drone attack, we have to think about securing their flat first and foremost. But working on dementia is also critically important, and has a huge impact on local communities as well, and as well as everything that Gill mentioned around improving healthy lifestyles, promoting reduction in smoking, reduction in blood pressure, etc.
That was good, Jill. Beth, one quick question, Beth, for you, and then we'll come back to Jill for a few more questions. Beth, you talked about helping family members support those that were living with dementia. What sort of support, what sort of advice does one give to family members?
I mean, it ranges from, particularly in the early years, it was really distributing informational leaflets that we produced with Jewish Care and translated into Russian then, about the basics of dementia, communication tips, ideas for activities, trying to help family members understand what was happening to their loved ones where they previously didn't understand. And then it also important to provide respite opportunities. So that could be a regular social activity where carers are given a space to share, discuss the challenges, or just have a distraction from the daily burden of care, and also providing activities for people with dementia and their carers to enjoy time together as well in a safe environment. So really a lot of it is actually about providing a space where people, apart from the Jewish community centres, there really aren't spaces like we have here, community centres, day lunch clubs, etc. So it's really providing the space, giving them someone to call and to ask for advice, or just to share what they're going through. And particularly during COVID, that was really important. There were a lot of online support sessions. Not everybody, is willing or able to join, but those who do, I think that they found it quite important.
Thank you, Beth. Well, I've got time for a few questions fired at you, Jill. It's quite a specific one, Jill. If someone takes SSRIs, I'm sure you know what that is, but I don't, regularly, would that increase dementia? And if one then stopped them, is there a better chance of not developing dementia? Maybe explain what SSRIs are.
SSRIs are probably the commonest type of antidepressants, and sertraline is probably the commonest ones that people take, but the citalopram is another one. It doesn't increase the chance of taking them. Treated depression makes people less likely to develop dementia. So no, it doesn't. If you need them, then you should be taking them. And if you do want to stop them, because I presume it's a specific question for somebody, do it slowly, because stopping them suddenly can lead to some withdrawal effects.
Okay, and two practical ones here. Are there any specific foods that might, when I can ask Jewish one, specific foods that might minimize dementia? And is there any connection between lack of sleep and onset of dementia?
Well, let me start off with sleep. So I think that sleep is very controversial with a lot of contradictory evidence. We know that as people are developing dementia, then their sleep gets very disturbed. But what we're not sure about, I think the evidence is probably that it's not important, is that people who have little sleep, are they more likely to develop dementia if they have little sleep when they're in midlife? And I think that's probably because it's the reason why it's complex and you get contradictory evidence is that the reason why people have lack of sleep can be hugely varied. So you can have lack of sleep because you're in pain and you're physically ill. You can have it because you're depressed. You can have it because you're extremely busy and you're working very hard. You've got family members keeping you awake. There can be a lot of different things that causes a lack of sleep. So it has different causes, but sleep apnea syndrome, which is a specific problem, does tend to increase your chance of getting dementia when you have less oxygen going to your brain.
And food?
Right, well, thank you for remembering that. Food, we don't think, It is good for you to eat a Mediterranean diet. You'll be unsurprised to know, everybody knows that. It's good for you to eat a Mediterranean diet. It's good for you to be not obese. Doesn't seem to matter much if you're a bit overweight, but being not obese is good for you. So having a BMI of less than 30, and that's obviously connected to food. It's not clear that specific food makes a difference, but in general, it's good for your health. And will do you no harm to eat high fruit and vegetables, and to be careful about what you eat.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I've still got a number of unanswered questions. I'll keep these questions, and either Gill or Beth will respond where we've got your address. I've had a number of very moving messages, mostly about individuals who have family members suffering from dementia and have learned a lot and feel supported by this webinar. I mean, we're thinking of you, and I would encourage that. I mean, for those that have family members, any signposting, Gill, Beth, we can recommend where people can get further support?
The Alzheimer's Society has a helpline, as does Dementia UK, and you can phone them with anything and ask for signposting. Local NHS services should be helpful, but I know they're extremely variable. So some you get a lot and some you get very little from, but the Alzheimer's Society should know what there is locally and be able to signpost you and give you some information.
So listen, that's absolutely fantastic. I'm very conscious of your message, Gill, for us all to be ambitious about prevention. I've always liked Beth emphasising to World Relief that we're a dementia friend and that we need to find more dementia friends, because we know, I mean, there's a lot unknown, and I think you've debunked the myth that prevention isn't possible, Gill. You've packed an enormous amount into a very short period of time. We're immensely grateful for your wisdom and thoughts and advice and guidance. A big thank you, Beth, for reminding us of the horrors that older people, well, all Ukrainians face at the moment, particularly older people, and the shout out to World Relief of being a leading organisation addressing some of those needs. And a big thank you to all participants online. I appreciate you listening in. I appreciate you being a friend of World Relief. Let's hope you also now a dementia friend. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. Look after yourselves. Remind yourselves of those 14 preventative measures. And if you've got further questions, don't be afraid to send a message to the info@worldrelief.org email address, and we'll get back to you. So thank you, Gill. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Gill.
Thanks, Beth. You're doing amazing stuff, really amazing. You should, World Relief should be really proud.
Thank you. Speak to you soon.
See you soon then. Bye.